happened then. Okay, good evening, and I welcome everyone here to the December 18th Village Board meeting. If we can all stand for the pledge.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Motion, yep. At this time, I make a motion that we adjourn to go into a public session,
Workshop.
public workshop, excuse me, public workshop. I need a motion.
I'll make that motion.
I'll second it.
Call the question?
Aye.
Aye. Aye. Aye.
Aye, so carried, 5 zip. Thank you. Tomorrow? Yes. Okay. Okay, so good evening, and I would advise that everyone in the public be aware, and everybody here on the board, that the intent of this meeting is to discuss, excuse me, to hear from our consultant, Bonnie Franson, on the local law proposal, local law 9, I believe that is. Yeah, right now, right. Okay. So I think at this time, we just advise everybody that this is not an interactive thing. There'll be no back and forth with the public and the board. And the purpose of this is to learn from the consultant what she has prepared.
So, good evening, village board members and members of the public. My name is Bonnie Franson. I'm a partner and planner with Nelson Pope and Voorhees. And we've been working with the village board to come up with a law that is intended to protect historic buildings within the village that are listed on the National Register of Historic Places by allowing some adaptive reuse of those buildings. In other words, allowing uses that may not otherwise be allowed within certain zoning districts. So you've had a local law in front of you for review. The local law, in terms of procedure at this point, an initial law went to the building department and the planning board secretary, who offered comments. You then received additional comments from the public that were considered. You received comments from your planning board that were also taken into consideration in the most recent draft. As required by law, the local law, which is changing your zoning chapter, was referred to Orange County Department of Planning, who had comments which are, they issued them as a local determination, which means you can consider them, but with regard to actually having to integrate them into any law, it's not required. There's no supersession situation with regard to these comments. In other words, if they had said they wanted you to modify your law and you didn't want to, you would have had to have voted by a majority +1. So that's not the case here. It's local determination. And in fact, I think this is newer compared to some of the other comments. So I'll just read that. They note that the local law provides for the adaptive reuse of historic register buildings for a variety of uses, including senior adult housing, which is defined. They felt that limiting that proposed group housing to just seniors may be limited in nature. But I think, you know, while you can take this into consideration, I know the village has really felt the need to allow some opportunities for senior citizens. And so if at some point you want to look more broadly at what you can allow in the village, that's fine. But I think the intent here is, again, to allow certain uses to occur within the historic buildings, and any kind of additional housing be limited to senior citizens, which is the way that the law has been drafted. Yep. So that's what I was reading from. Again, I mentioned the planning board's comments. I won't go into detail, but those are from 11/20/2018. If you do have any comments or questions with regard to anything that you've received to date, we're happy to respond and provide comments on that. So the law itself,
Also, did receive comments from Howard Zuckerman, which we also took into consideration.
So, the law itself now, again, the purpose of it is to allow for the adaptive reuse of historic buildings that are listed on the National Register, and specifically, they have to be on the National Register. We don't want anyone just coming in and saying, hey, I happen to have a historic building, can I, use it for these purposes? No. This is almost a reward being given to a property owner who has protected their property to the extent that they've even allowed it to be listed on the National Register. Something that the board may not be aware of is that any property owner does not have to consent to National Register listing. And when they do that, they're identified as National Register eligible, but again, they don't have to consent. So when they do consent, it really is giving them a benefit in terms of a use to promote and to encourage them to keep it in its National Register status. The procedures themselves, we tried to simplify this, and essentially the planning board would be responsible for reviewing applications. It would be by special use permit. So there are a set of procedures and standards applicable to special use permit and site plan approval that the planning board follows. It requires a public hearing, so the public, whomever may be around in the neighborhood, that particular site that may be requesting one of these adaptive reuses, there's an opportunity for the public to comment during the public review process. Also, they will be, any application will be subject to architectural review as well, which is important because we are talking about the aesthetics of a historic building, so appropriately it should be reviewed. The specific uses that would be allowed as per this local law are professional office, arts and crafts studio, a bed and breakfast, museum or art gallery, and senior adult home. And we specifically identified professional office differently than just a office as per your zoning law, because we really wanted it to be much more of just almost a professional office where you might have a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer. Our concern is that we feel that some of the definitions may be overly broad in the zoning, and some may interpret, for instance, a plumber. I'm not picking on plumbers, but I'm just saying a plumber who may have an office, but in fact the reality is they're also storing a lot of equipment that they need in their trade as well as materials. So we didn't want that happening on a National Register property site. So we really tried to limit it to the kinds of uses that don't have that requirement for storage, et cetera.
That was one of the comments, I think, by the planning board.
Right. Why we were defining it in this manner. And it was, again, to protect the building itself, and then, recognize that these historic buildings, we're not saying that they're only allowed in one particular zone or the other. They're wherever they occur. So we need to make sure that the kinds of uses are reasonable, because you could have one of these properties in a residential zone. So we didn't want to, again, allow certain uses that might not be consistent with the residential character of a particular neighborhood where this reuse may occur. There are standards here for, again, the building must be listed on the National Register. There must be consultation with the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, the State Historic Preservation Office, to get their comments with regard to changes and alterations to any historic building. There are specific bulk standards that apply when anyone proposes to extend or expand a building, although as set forth in the law, there's a desire not to have additions, because to some extent that starts to change the integrity of the building and its historic character. So there's really a desire not, it's discouraged. And
Actually, if you look at F2, it says that the historic building shall not require an addition or expansion.
Right.
So it's mandatory.
Right.
That, you can't take a historic home and add a third floor or add, a whole new section to it so that to accommodate the use.
Right.
It has to remain in the state.
Right.
Wherein it's actually listed,
Right.
eligible to be listed.
And in those instances, then whatever the lot size is for that area, will apply to most of the uses, with the exception of the senior adult home. In that instance, given the nature of the dwelling and the potential to have, different numbers in terms of occupancy of the home, we originally had set it up so that there was just a baseline minimum lot size, and then for every occupant, senior occupant, you had to have an additional square footage of lot area. And this was intended to really kind of keep a cap on the total number of occupants in the building. I believe there was a change that may have been made in part because the planning board may not have understood the intent with the lot area. I would advocate that we put back in the requirement that there be additional lot area for every senior citizen as a way of controlling the density of how many occupants you may have within a National Register building.
And I did make that change, and that is I made a change.
It's on my page 5, E, senior adult home. It's number Roman numeral I. Right. So what this, so what was intended was you have a minimum lot size of 20,000 square feet, period. And then for every senior citizen that might occupy the building, you have to have an additional 5,000 square feet of lot area. So if you had a 1 acre lot, or let's say a builder's acre, 40,000 square feet, it's 20,000 square feet, and then you're calculating the occupancy on the 20,000 additional. So it would be 4, if, as a planner, my math is
That's right.
relatively accurate.
So I think that even I was confused
Yeah.
a little bit by
So,
that.
so I think we need to,
It's not 4
right,
in the 20 and
Correct.
then 4 additional for the additional 20.
right. It was having a baseline of 20 and then an additional 5,000 for every, yeah.
Trigger for each resident.
Correct. So that was the intent. And if it's not clear, and if the board feels that it's reasonable to have some kind of standard for ensuring there's a certain maximum density of residents in a home, then we should include something there, whatever that is. A cap. And, well, that's another aspect of this. I don't know if we want to have an absolute cap as well. There's a density that's controlled by the 5,000 square foot requirement, but the village board may feel that, you know what, anything getting beyond 15, 20, 10, whatever the number is, may go beyond what would be reasonable for a residential neighborhood within which a building could be situated. So we may want some just maximum look, if it goes beyond 20, it's a little too much, or not, but I think it's something you might want to consider.
How are the parking standards, the underlying parking standards for the uses? Are the parking standards they're in the, oh no, so the parking in this local law really is up to the planning board,
Correct.
is that correct?
Yes.
So the planning board arguably has some discretion to limit the occupancy based on parking. In other words, the applicant would, by the senior home, how many parking spaces might I need for a certain number of seniors? So on one hand, there is something that the board can look at, which is set up here, for example, to say, okay, if the lot is this big, you get so many. If it's that big, you get so many more. And then that could be arguably modified by the planning board, who says, you do, but you have all active seniors, and they're all going to have cars, so I think there is some discretion there. I don't know
Yeah.
if that's too much discretion,
Um,
not enough discretion.
I would be a little bit concerned because, so we do regulate lot coverage in the village. And here we have maximum lot coverage of 35%. But lot coverage, according to the new code, is defined as a percentage of the lot area that is occupied by the area of the building or group of buildings. Frankly, that's not typically the way communities are regulating land use anymore. They are typically regulating according to impervious surface coverage, which also includes the parking area.
Driveway.
Yeah, because what could happen if it's the building, you know, and then to accommodate a certain number of residents, you could end up with a lot of parking area. And again, an area that's mostly residential in character. So, I don't know that, you know, I'd be concerned about, the amount of parking that could occur, again, on one of these sites, which was in part why we required the additional 5,000 square feet. Let's say every resident had a car, typical parking spaces, you know, 10 by 20, which is 200 square feet, but you're requiring 5,000 square feet, you know, additional for everyone on the lot. So there's plenty of room to provide a parking space and have a lot of open space still. So, and just in the future, if you're ever considering amendments to the zoning, I think you need to give serious consideration to regulating impervious surfaces so that you don't end up in a situation where you're designing a building, it looks attractive, and then it's otherwise surrounded by a sea of asphalt. If you really want landscaping and you want the village to have a certain aesthetic with landscaping, we should try and put a cap on some of the impervious surface. But that's a different, you know, matter, a different item.
So it sounds like Bonnie's taken this into consideration in that 20,000 square foot plus 5,000. And perhaps if we leave it like that, we don't really have to worry too much about, for example, parking.
Right.
And we can still give the planning board some discretion as it does.
I know that Elise had changed some requirements as far as legal assurances, certificates of use, certificates of occupancy, especially for the adult homes, to ensure that the occupancy remains what it's intended to be and what it's approved as, so there's some kind of monitoring that occurs. Also, some limits in terms of having to reapprove or have a recertification of that particular special use. But, you know, otherwise, I think that the adaptive reuse law is fairly simple. It's just, again, allowing a certain number of uses that might not be otherwise allowed, depending on where the building is located and the property is located, and to give properties an opportunity to be National Register buildings and properties to be developed and used, and as a result of keeping it in its National Register status, the owner gets, again, a benefit. So I don't know if there's anything else you want to cover in particular, Elise?
The definition, because there were some questions by the public.
About senior adult.
The definition itself.
Okay. So, right now, senior adult home, for members of the public who may not have this in front of them, family-type home for adults established and operated for purposes of providing residential housing to senior citizens ages 65 and older. So there was a change. We went from 62 to 65.
And of course, that's up to the board.
What you define as senior citizen. My recollection is there wasn't a definition in the zoning law. It was almost embedded, I think, in some of the requirements. So we actually include now a definition of senior citizen. Adult home provides temporary or long-term residential care and services to senior citizens who, though not requiring continual medical or nursing care, as provided by facilities licensed or operated pursuant to Article 28 of the New York State Public Health Law or other articles that are referenced of the mental hygiene law, are, by reason of physical or other limitations associated with age, unable or substantially unable to live independently. Senior adult home provides housing in a community integrated setting with supportive services such as meals, housekeeping, social activities, transportation, similar support services. And the adult home is required to operate under a certificate from the New York State Department of Social Services or a permit from the New York State Department of Health and any other applicable state, county, and other regulations. And then we explicitly say that this definition should not be construed to allow a nursing home, drug or alcohol rehabilitation center, homeless shelter, single-room occupancy housing, or other boarding house. So it's very specific in its intent. There was a comment that was, I think, raised by the planning board that, I believe it was planning board, why are we creating this or allowing this? Because there are senior citizen housing regulations already in the zoning. The difference is right now, the way that the village regulates senior housing is you're really requiring the development of senior housing dwelling units. So if you're in a multifamily, let's say, building, you have multiple dwelling units for each senior citizen. This is not that type of housing. This is a building with rooms that are occupied by seniors, and they're sharing kitchens, they're sharing other types of space that you would normally have in an individual dwelling unit. So we couldn't regulate it really under the senior citizen law because it's a different kind of senior housing. So that's sort of an explanation to why we went and have these definitions and additional standards set forth.
Could you just repeat the first half of to the question, why are we doing this when we currently have it in our zoning? Your first piece of this reflected on senior housing, period.
Right.
Could you just repeat that?
Sure. So again, the village allows senior citizen housing, but the manner in which it's regulated right now is based on my review of the law. It requires that each senior citizen or senior citizen household be inhabiting a dwelling unit, meaning they're going to be occupying a space that has a kitchen, a bathroom, a bedroom, everything that you would have in a full dwelling unit as regulated by, New York State Building Code. This is, again, a special kind of senior housing that's being provided to a person who is going to live essentially in a room as opposed to a dwelling unit. And so they live in their bedroom. They have maybe certain things that are allowed in their bedroom, but for the most part, the kitchen facilities, the bathroom facilities, those types of typical dwelling unit spaces are shared among all the residents. So it's different.
So essentially, I mean, you might have a bathroom in your room, I
Possibly,
suppose,
but
you're
not a
gonna
kitchen.
have a kitchen.
No. And in fact,
The
I
communal
believe,
areas amongst all of the
Right.
residents.
right. Because the idea is they're not self-supportive, so they need assistance, and there are individuals who will be there on site providing caregiving services for those who don't have the ability to do certain things for themselves. That's where they're getting the assistance.
Also, in response to some of the comments, what's in the wrong thing, that you got, there was some concern that, of sort of a double occupancy. So you have the senior adult home, then you have the owner living there, you have a caretaker living there, and suddenly it's, it's really an owner's property with one person who's a senior citizen, and it's a senior citizen home. So we did add some language not that we thought the village board didn't want to allow the owner of the home perhaps live there as well, if the property is big enough to accommodate the 20,000 plus 5. But we added language that in no event shall the residential use of the property by the owner be greater than 20% of the total square footage. Now, in conjunction with that, something we haven't talked about is, and I guess this is probably not, shouldn't be a concern because it has to be licensed with a certificate. Therefore, my assumption is, and I believe I'm correct about this, that you can't just have one senior citizen living there and get a license.
Correct.
So I think that there's a balance there between the use of a historic property as a senior adult home, as well as perhaps a residential use for the person who owns the home, maybe someone who's living there as part of it as a caretaker.
And I also think, practically speaking, I don't know what the benefit, I just don't know what the benefit would be of an individual residing in their home, which would just be a single-family dwelling, with an individual senior.
Yeah, probably, well,
I don't know. I mean, I just don't know. So
I mean,
I don't know that we would expect that, but regardless, the regulations are addressing any of those concerns.
Do we know how many seniors it requires to get the license to be a senior adult home?
I suspect,
Five or more, okay.
I'd want to look that up, only, not that I, I appreciate the response. They're different types of facilities, and it's very detailed, whether you're operating a particular kind of home or facility. I can provide that. It's been expressed that it's 5, but we can look into that.
Yeah, we can confirm it for the board.
Yeah.
So it almost seems to me like the 20, the 20,000 square feet required is almost a moot point, because based on where we'd like to write the law,
Right.
it should be more like 45,000 square feet if we're going to include 5,000
Oh,
for
you're
each.
basing it on the 5? 25 and 20 is your point.
Yes.
So in
Based
other
on
words, if you need a minimum of 5, then why not have the 20,000 plus the 25,000 that's
Right.
needed up front, because you're going to need 5 anyway.
Right.
We could take a look and just, again, confirm the requirement of 5.
We can look at that and see what the impact would be.
Okay.
I mean, I think we don't want to draft the local laws in such a restrictive manner that no one
Right, right. Or maybe amending the amount of square feet, additional square feet is required for each additional senior, instead of 5,
Right,
a smaller square footage amount.
right.
But that would be the basis for, the square footage. Like the 25K is based on the 5K conversation.
Yes.
Right.
Should the board say, well, you know what, we see it at 3? Just saying.
Right.
That'd be 15.
Right.
So then that would be 35. I'm not suggesting that to the board, I'm just saying, right?
As an example.
Right.
So maybe, we could, one thing the board could ask Bonnie to do is just take a look at the different, if it's 25 and then additional, what is reasonable? Is 5,000 additional reasonable, where maybe 3,000 would be reasonable? I mean,
Mhm.
what would be the impact?
I just want to make sure, and it's particularly, where we're talking about potential historic buildings, and we have to think of the future, because, there could be another property that's in the village that is historic, that they actually go and then do what they have to do to be listed on the National Register. They now become eligible for some of these uses. So we want to make sure that the threshold is set, that, again, the minimum lot area is such that it will still fit within the residential character of the neighborhood. And we know we have an SR 10 district, an SR 20 district. We know what the minimums are for those districts. So we're actually starting at the higher 20,000 and then requiring additional for occupants.
The other ramification that the board should keep in mind as it looks at this local law is that, like any zoning law, a person who's this close to it can go to the zoning board of appeals for a variance of the bulk regulations, for example. Much harder to get a use variance, but certainly bulk variances can be modified by the zoning board of appeals so long as the board finds that it's reasonable to do so. Or they can also be denied. So as much as this local law is a pattern for applicants and the boards to follow, there is the ability to modify some through the variance process. That, by the way, is an exception to the rule.
Questions, comments? I know you've had this for a while, so you've had the opportunity to review it, and we've actually gone through several iterations to take into
Yep.
consideration comments. there's been a public hearing as well over the lease? Yeah, okay, and that's been closed, and we've done the seeker review. You have your environmental assessment form, long form with narrative.
It's been referred, so it's ready to be adopted, although obviously there are some outstanding questions. I would not recommend that the board take any action tonight, but I wouldn't, I don't see anything here that would require much more delay beyond the next meeting, for example, unless the board sees something.
And then, Elise, the only other thing that I'd like to go over with you, and this is more procedural, is just the certificate of use itself. So,
What are you looking at there, which?
page 3, senior adult homes. So the code enforcement officer issues a certificate of use upon determination of compliance. And then under senior adult homes, properties that have been issued a special permit and site plan approval under this section for use as a senior adult home shall file a certificate of use that shall attest to compliance with this section.
Okay.
So the certificate of use, I think, is coming from the code enforcement officer. I think this was intended to address a concern of the planning boards with regard to compliance and making sure, again, the number of occupants are reviewed over time to ensure that everything's being met and that the use is compliant. But I just want to look at the wording.
All right.
But that's more technical. It's not substantively changing anything.
All right, we'll do that.
Carrie, do you have anything? Any questions, comments?
No? I don't.
Sure? Okay. Deb? Dory? Okay. I'm sorry? I think you should have any questions you have on the table.
All right, so my only concern was when we were just discussing the square footage. By changing that, wouldn't that just open up more area, possible, you know?
If we lower it, I don't know that it would. If we lower it, yes, because if we have a minimum lot area size and we reduce the area required per each senior, then potentially properties that may not have been eligible are now eligible by lot area. If we go downward. Obviously, if we go upward, then it's the opposite effect.
But
I
out-
thought the proposal was to look at either going up to 25,000 plus, or keeping it at 20 and lowering the plus from 5,000 to maybe something smaller. You were gonna look into.
Right.
what
I
the
think,
impact might be.
right, my understanding of what was discussed was that if 5 is the minimum, that's required to operate this facility, then why not just say the minimum lot size is 45,000 square feet? I don't know that anyone wanted necessarily us to change the 5,000 increments beyond. So beyond 5, did the board still want us to then say, okay, every additional 5,000 square feet, you are allowed another senior occupant? I don't know if you wanted us to look at, go to 2,500 square feet per occupant.
Well, I think we need to take a look at what the impact would be. If we were to say that the minimum requirement is 45,000 square feet, and then we take a look at the properties that
That
would
are
be
left.
impacted by this, if we don't have any properties left, then
then
obviously
what's the
this is
point?
for naught. Exactly.
Okay.
In which case, then we would need to take a look at minimizing that square foot to, say, 4,000 square feet per senior, or 3,000, whatever the case may be.
Okay.
But if the 45,000 square feet provides us with historically,
Pool of,
yes, then I
Historic
think that we're fine
properties.
with it. I
Okay.
don't think we need to go any further with that.
okay, so it had more to do with the eligibility and the effect of going to 45,000?
Yes.
Okay, understood.
I've thought of another question. It has nothing to do with the senior adult homes. This law is going to allow for the historic properties to also be used for arts and crafts studios,
Art gallery,
art galleries.
museum.
Have we specified, I don't recall the last time I took a look at the bill, at the law. Have we specified how much parking would be required per each use?
We had in the regulations right now that the planning board authorized to determine appropriate parking requirements.
Okay.
So it would be done at the special use permit stage, but we didn't establish parking
And individually?
standards.
Each
No.
one would be looked at as an individual
I
basis?
think in the bulk tables, I
Right.
think it actually refers to that.
I know that you have standards, a whole set of standards,
Mm.
parking generation rates in your code. Nursing home, medical, dental, general office building, government office. I'm trying to see, for instance, if there's a museum here. No. So they would have to come up with, and that's actually often the case with zoning. A use sometimes comes in where the parking is just simply not addressed as far as what the rate is. And so it's determined often on a case-by-case basis using certain standards. Having said that, I believe that the planning board secretary indicated that the standards were not updated in this last review, the parking standards.
Good.
So if that's the case, at some point, these have to be looked at regardless. But right now, we have it that the planning board's going to do an evaluation of parking.
The other thing you'll sometimes see in local laws is, if the parking isn't defined for a very particular use, that the planning board then decides what's the next most like use. So, and they kind of can work off of that, that parking requirement. In this case, since the parking has, we've basically been told that the parking really needs to be updated. We thought in this local law, best to leave it up to the planning board, because then the special permits process allows, decide what is reasonable, what's safe, based on the particular use and the description of that particular use. Not all arts and crafts studios are going to need a lot of parking, some may need less. So I think at this point, the flexibility is not a bad thing to have in this local law, especially as we go forward. And, as with every local law, you put it in place, and if suddenly there's 10 applications before the zoning board of appeals for one particular or two particular things, we need to think about, well, maybe we need to address it by redrafting the local law or amending it, so that we don't have tons of ZBA applications. We miss something, or it isn't being applied in the way we expected it to be applied.
I mean, I think we attempted to at least limit area variances by, again, the lot that they're on is the lot that they're on. But we can't anticipate every potential variance, in part because this type of special permit is addressing buildings that go across zoning districts, which each have different standards. So, we'll have to see how it works out. But we do have some standards in there, as well as establishing, I think more importantly, the minimum lot area, which is really talking to now density and what's the minimum lot size to accommodate, again, a use which potentially could end up in a residential area.
And I know this board has indicated from the very beginning of my tenure here that, there's a strong preference to have a historic district, protect a historic district, to protect buildings that are within that historic district. And this is one way to do that, so that, owners are more, are incentivized, if you will, to protect their homes, especially if they're eligible.
Bonnie, would you know, should someone, after this law is adopted, or whatever iteration comes about and is adopted, and someone has the checklist, national designation, what happens, or do you know whether or not they can actually rescind that designation for any reason nationally?
They wouldn't rescind it. I think we have a compliance requirement. The certificate of use has to be updated, or is that just for the senior adult home?
That's just for the senior adult home.
I'm pretty sure, I thought we had in here that there had to be continuing compliance.
I think you might be right.
I thought I heard you say it, but it's not, I'm not thinking about the law, I'm thinking about the
Right,
owner occupant.
right. So what we don't want to happen is that the use is allowed, and then suddenly there are all these alterations to the building. And my recollection is we had added the expectation that,
There is a section, remember this gets,
Yes.
all applications get referred to SHPO, and the planning board cannot act without having received and reviewed the comments of SHPO. So I would think that,
well, and also we put on page 6, we had that continuing maintenance of the building exterior to protect its historic character shall be a condition for the issuance of any special use permit. Continuous listing on the National Register of Historic Places and State Register of Historic Places shall be a condition of any approval, and failure to maintain same shall be deemed a violation of the special use permit.
I
So,
think it's also in the certificate of compliance, I think, that it's,
so we'll look at this section, but your concern is that, okay, again, someone can alter a building, and in fact, SHPO's not going to know unless SHPO was told that the building has been altered. So, to some extent, this has to be enforced at the village level. But we want to make sure that, again, we understand that to have as a condition of the special permit, the requirement is that it may be maintained so that it continues to be listed on the National Register of Historic Places. They could argue that we're still on the National Register of Historic Places even though they altered the building. So there has to probably be something a little more added
so could we,
beyond listing that it remains in its historic state. Would just have to find the right wording to address your concern, Neil.
so in other words, I want to make sure I understand this. So I'm on the listing, and I've been on it for 10 years, but in the meantime, I've been doing all these alterations to my house,
Right.
and I haven't updated SHPO, so I'm still on it as far as SHPO is
They
concerned.
wouldn't know.
They wouldn't know.
Unless someone told them. Right. An example is, up in the town of Shawangum, where I work, they have a bridge that was on the National Register. Because of flooding issues and safety issues going over the Walco River, they changed the bridge. And it was an older, architecturally attractive, I think like an iron bridge, and now it's like a concrete, still intended to be decorative, but it's not the historic bridge that it was. We looked up, as a result of looking up an application, it's still National Register listed, because I don't know that SHPO would know that these changes were made if there wasn't consultation with them.
So the wood-covered bridge is gone, a concrete bunker is now installed, and SHPO doesn't know of it, but it's still designated as a historical
As a
bridge.
store, right. So we need a little more then.
Yeah, maybe some type of letter from SHPO with the application. Maybe the requirement is that, I mean, I don't know how you, once you get that listing,
Right.
can SHPO throw you off the listing because you've done something to your house or your building? So then it may be and we can think about this, but maybe a requirement would be to, as soon as the application comes in and when it gets referred to SHPO, wouldn't you also want to refer, for example, pictures of the house or the building?
That would be part of it.
Yeah, so then would SHPO then,
They would have the information they need to make a determination as to whether it's been changed.
yeah,
And that would be part of the record in front of the planning board as well.
So that might be, maybe we have
I
it
think we
in
need the
here,
record, yeah,
and we just need to clarify it a little bit.
yeah, I agree. I mean, and the reality is, and this is just generally with National Register, just because you're on the National Register doesn't mean that the building's going to be protected at the local level. You're on the National Register, and if you wanted to pull a building permit to demolish any building that's on the National Register, it can happen tomorrow. So the only way to preserve your historic buildings here in the village is to actually create your own local landmark law, where you know, the village establishes a local law, and if someone wants to demolish one of these historic buildings that have been designated locally, they have to go through a review process and show that they couldn't have used it or reused it, and that it has to be demolished. So, you know, I don't want anyone to think that National Register, this is kind of a separate topic, but that National Register listing protects all our historic resources in the village. It doesn't. The only way you're gonna protect them is to have a local landmark law.
Which is something that I know this board has been at least thinking about, as well as reinstating an architectural review board, that sort of thing.
In fact, if you do, however you set it up, an ARB could also be a historic board as well. I think Cold Spring kind of operates like that.
Well,
Montebello, yep.
Has a separate board.
Mm-hmm.
The planning board is architectural review board, but has a separate board that just approves anything that's going to be done potentially to a building that's listed, or a building, I forget how it's designated,
Right.
within, that they've decided is historic, or maybe just anything,
Yeah.
anything in that village. They're very restrictive.
So we'll check the language, at least for this final
There are
version.
a couple procedural things to do, as well as 45,000,
Mhm.
25,000, 20,000 square foot.
I think if, what maybe a good idea is just to maybe just generate a list of what we generated in conversation here, so that we're all exactly on the same page, and distribute it, and get the revised, where there is revision, and then get it back out to us so that we could see what we finally come up with.
Yeah, I have right now,
Checklist would be critical, I mean, 'cause
Yeah.
we've hit 20 pieces.
right, I have the primary comments have to do with looking at the occupancy, and then the lot area for the senior adult home.
The bulk, including the pervious and,
Well, that, we can take a look at.
But
That's more like
a modification
that's a
to the zoning.
village-wide, unless we want to just throw in an impervious coverage for this, but that might be difficult.
I wouldn't suggest doing that at this point. I think that is an issue like parking. It is much more a modification to the underlying zoning law.
Yeah.
okay,
The-
that
there's
this
cer-
board may want to-
The references to certificate of use, we'll just make sure that it's
Certificates of compliance,
certificate of compliance,
and then protection. of-
SHPO, or the wording with regard to SHPO and National Register, and maintaining it.
So those are my three as well.
and we mentioned something about parking calculations,
We, in the local law as it's drafted today, it's up to the planning board to see what's reasonable and safe. The underlying, according to the planning board secretary, the underlying parking regulations were not amended as part
Right.
of the big zoning amendment that we did, and she had suggested they need to be amended.
Right.
Which is another reason why, at this point in time, before those are amended, it's probably a good idea to just leave this the way it is and allow the planning board to decide if it's reasonable and safe.
okay. So Frau, if there's nothing further from anyone? if should you have something, I suggest we get it to Bonnie, or get it to the clerk, she'll get it to Bonnie, and we'll add to it, but otherwise, what we've got is what we have currently. Okay? Okay, anything further? No? Okay, the time now is 6:40. I make a motion that we close this workshop.
I'll make that motion.
Question?
Aye.
The 3rd, January 3rd.
So we need to get this to you in advance of the January 3rd, so you can consider it January 3rd.
Or it's the 15th.
So the 3rd or the 15th?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Yeah, and I think given the holiday, given the cycle, given your lives, given everything, I'd say that that's more realistic.
15th, maybe more. All right. Very good.
Sorry?
Yeah.
I think it's, yes, you said Thursday, right? And that's what we do.
I actually think we
hold it
might be
off.
able to turn it around, but thank you for offering the
Yeah,
15th, because time does get away with us when we think it won't.
Especially when you're into Christmas.
Especially at this time of the year.
All right, Mayor.
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much.
for all your work.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
it.
Merry Christmas.
Merry
Merry
Happy
Christmas,
holidays.
Happy New Year.